In August 1992, the sleepy town of Bargo near Sydney becomes the scene of the most horrendous crime.
She was so beautiful, I just knew somebody had taken her. I can't believe that another human being would do that to a little girl or any child.
9-year-old Ebony Simpson has vanished without a trace whilst walking home from school.
There's no reason for her not to have come home. You can only assume that something's happened.
It's everybody's nightmare, a parent's nightmare, their child being abducted.
Ebony, if you're out there, darling, and if you can get home or give us a ring.
It's pretty much the worst case scenario.
The fate of the schoolgirl will unfold in the most shocking way.
He knew where she was all the time. He joined the search party.
All that time we were looking for Ebony, and the killer's car is a few yards away. I hadn't heard something as callous as being on the search party to cover your tracks. It disgusts me 20 years later.
The abduction of Ebony Simpson was so horrific, it rocks the foundations of a close-knit community and is a crime that shook Australia. On the afternoon of Wednesday the 19th of August, 1992, pretty Ebony Simpson disappeared on her way home from school.
She went to school, she didn't come home. And she got off the school bus and, you know, she had to walk a couple of 100 yards just up the road. And she just didn't come home.
The tragedy that was to unfold would rip through the heart of a family who had moved to the small town of Bargo many years before to start a new life.
We'd bought an old farmhouse and done that up. We'd been there about 14 years. We'd chosen to live in the country, and the boys at a country school, and then Ebony came along. So it was an ideal life for children and us.
With 2 young boys, Christine and her husband Peter completed their family with the arrival of their daughter, Ebony Jane, in 1983.
I remember when I had Ebony, I had 2 boys and then I had Ebony, and I just couldn't believe I got this beautiful little girl. Yeah, she was pretty special. She was soft, kind, and we were very close. She was just lovely and warm. It was just really nice, you know, a nice way to live. And we moved to the country so that the kids would have a better life, and then this happened to us.
The Simpsons built their new life on their farm until everything changed in August 1992.
Ebony had a talk at school with the police the day before about stranger danger. She came home and told me. I said to her, if anything ever comes up, you know, in your life, anything happens, you have to come home and tell me, you know. Then, you know, I read her a story, she went to bed. And the next day when she went to school, she didn't come home.
The usual school routine meant Christine met Ebony at the bus stop, just meters away from their house, at the end of the day.
Normally I was always home and I was always there. And we were getting insurance and I was a bit late, and I said to one of my sons, you know, just go down and meet the bus for Ebony. I'll be a little bit late, but I won't be far away.
Ebony's school was only 5 kilometers away from the Simpson home. Her bus journey took 10 minutes, and the walk from the bus stop up to the Simpson farm was just 1 kilometer away. But this last-minute change of plan brought a strange twist of fate.
His bus was late and he thought she was at home, and then I came home and And as soon as I pulled up at the house, I knew that there was no shoes there. Ebony's shoes weren't at the front door. My husband at the time, Peter, notified the police, rang them, and I went down to the bus stop. And then I went along the road and I ran through the creek and I went in the house next door looking for her, thinking maybe she got scared or something, you know. But she was a very responsible young girl, you know. She was 9, nearly 10 at the time.
I drove out to the Simpsons' home where I met with a bunch of other police that were waiting there for me.
Local officers quickly began an action plan to search for the schoolgirl.
The first information I was given was that Ebony had caught the school bus from Bargo School, and she was seen to actually get off the bus at the corner of Arena Road and Bargo Road and started walking towards her house.
Rod Grant now had a possible sighting, but Ebony's movements were still sketchy. As the search for her got underway, further news came in.
An older man come up to the command post. He'd heard that there was something wrong and a lot of police cars, so he come up to ask what was happening. And he told the General Duties Police that his 2 sons had seen Ebony walking home, and just before she got around the corner just near her house, there was a small yellow car with a man with the bonnet up. And the boys waved to her, to Ebony, and she waved back to them, and they continued driving home.
This new information placed somebody else in the vicinity, but police needed more.
Then I went inside and I spoke to Peter and Christine Simpson. Got some background information about Ebony, her normal behaviours. Pretty much wanted to find out, you know, is this out of the norm? And straight away, you could tell it was completely out of the norm. Yeah, because she was a very reliable young girl, come from a good family background, no dramas at all.
And further news is to heighten the growing sense of panic.
Once she got to that car, she didn't make it past that point because there's a couple more houses between her home and where this car was. And so we had a confirmed sighting that she was at that site, so she didn't make it past there. And so then the alarm bells are ringing.
Nine-year-old Ebony Simpson has gone missing on her way home from school. A delay with her brother's bus meant that he didn't get back in time to meet her. Ebony's house is only a kilometre away from the bus stop, but in that short distance, she has vanished. And now, to add to the rising panic, neighbours report seeing her walking towards a stranger's car, but there has been no sign of her since.
I don't know when you let a child get off a school bus. We'd lived there for 14 years. People said, oh, let her get off the bus. All kids should be allowed to do that and just walk around up the corner and home. It's a part of growing up, but, you know, obviously I'm wrong.
Ebony has now been missing for hours. With her family frantic with worry, this news of a sighting of her and a car spotted on her route home, officers were now in a race against time to discover where the little girl could have gone.
At that time, there's 2 tasks, and we had to separate that pretty early on. There's a search for Ebony, and there's also a criminal investigation, both taking place at the same time. So the search was set up as a grid pattern for several kilometres around where she was last seen. Homes and paddocks, dams, you know, bush.
By now, darkness has fallen. News of Ebony's disappearance is spreading through the community and beyond.
There's no reason for her not to have come home. We can only assume that something's happened.
As officers ramp up their search, they call on members of the public to help their plight.
I can still remember what's going through my mind. The priority is just to find her and find her alive. The whole town was volunteering to come and help. Everybody who was anybody, pretty much, was out there looking, searching. So that had to be coordinated because you couldn't just have people running around everywhere.
Police are looking for her, everybody's searching for her. I mean, helicopters were flying above, with sensor lights on them.
As the minutes turn into agonising hours for the Simpsons, buildings and acres of bushland are scoured for any clues.
I think you make anything up in your head that gets you through that time, but I don't think we slept. We just stood there waiting for some sort of answer. They said, oh, she would have gone to someone else's place to play, but she wouldn't do that. She wasn't like that, you know what I mean?
By the following morning, Christine and her family are desperate for news. As more people offer to help with the search, Rod Grant tries to uncover anything unusual during the last few weeks.
I'd spoken with Christine back at the house and I said, had she seen anything suspicious? And at first she said, no, she hadn't seen anybody suspicious hanging around. And then I remembered maybe I should rephrase the question. What have you seen? Have you seen any cars that don't, or people that don't fit the area? And then she said, well, matter of fact, I saw a man parked down near the bus stop in a small yellow car. She said, I think it was a Datsun 120Y.
This was now the second description given to Rod of a yellow car seen in the area.
Christine told me she actually saw that car twice. And from the canvass that we did with neighbours as well, that night and the following days, they said that they'd seen a car hang around for a few weeks, this little yellow car.
I thought he was just some young guy and, his car had broken down, and I went down to get Ebony off the bus and went past him, and I remember looking at him and thinking, I'll pick Ebony up and I'll come back around and I'll see if I can help you.
This vehicle is now becoming a major focus. Rod is desperate to see if Christine's account of this car is similar to the one seen by the two boys who waved at Ebony just moments before she vanished.
I pulled up my notebook and I started talking to one of the boys. He was 13 and his brother was 17. And they started straight away telling me what they'd seen. It was a Mazda 808. The bonnet was up. The man was leaning into the engine bay with something black in his hand. The car's fairly dirty. There's mud splashed up on the near side. And then he said, there's patch-up work on it as well. And you can see where somebody has painted. He said, it's called yellow ochre. And he told me the name of the colour. And I thought, oh my God, this is so much detail.
As a clearer picture is emerging on this vehicle last seen near Ebony, other officers work with her family as the search is scaled up.
Detective Sergeant Cole Pateman and Detective Sergeant Steve Foster, they went out to the Simpson household and sat out there with the Simpsons, and they got pretty much a really, really detailed background about, what Ebony was wearing that day, what she had in her backpack, what she had for lunch, all those sorts of details, all the background of the family, is there any problems?
The police command post, set up outside the Simpson home, has by now become a focal point for concerned residents, extra officers, and the country's media, all desperate to help.
Everybody was given an area to search. In their groups was the police, SES, Rural Fire Service, and just volunteers from the community. So they all had areas that they had to go and search.
There's a sense of urgency there. People running around and locals walking up to police, how can I get involved, how can I help? People arriving all the time, various specialist units arriving police-wise. A real big build-up right outside the family home.
A couple of police that were coming from Campbelltown arrived late to the briefing. They missed the briefing. And a sergeant there, he told them, they said, well, what's the go? What are we looking for? And they said, well, they described Ebony, and we're also looking for a yellow Mazda 808. And one of the guys said to the sergeant, he said, like that car over there. And the sergeant turned and looked at the car, which was parked at the command post, just not even 50 metres away. He said, if that's a Mazda 808, that's the type of car we're looking for. So, alarm bell started ringing again.
Astonishingly, this similar car was just yards away. But crucially, the officers cannot jump to conclusions. As they hone in on the vehicle, Christine is asked to describe the man she has seen in the days before.
My role at this stage was to do what they call a photo fit, or a Penry ID, based on information that Christine Simpson could provide me with. As you can imagine, she was going through a large amount of emotions at that time, so I had to be very careful with what I did and what I said to Christine. But in the end, she provided me with a brilliant description and a fantastic photo fit that would progress the investigation considerably.
What happens next is to be the biggest turning point in the hunt for Ebony so far.
We couldn't do anything more with what we had, with what she'd provided me. I walked outside, and as I was walking up to the front gate of the property, my boss came down, and I just said, well, this is what Christine Simpson's given me, and he took a step back and he said, oh, that's the bloke we were just talking to.
Wayne had put this picture together at the house. At the same time, the guys realised that we better watch this car and see who comes back to it. They're doing checks on who it belongs to.
One of the policemen came back down to our farm and they said, I think the guy's out the front. And they said to me, we want you to come and have a look at the car. And I went up to the front, out the front of our farm, and I had a look at the car and I said, well, it's similar, but I don't know, it's just a yellow car, you know. But the one thing was that when I saw him 3 days before losing Ebony, he was looking into the motor of the car and it was stopped on the side of the road, and it was a Mazda 808 and the bonnet opened the other way. And I remembered that, and that's what that car was.
The car has a striking resemblance to the yellow vehicle seen in the area. And the photo fit picture police have compiled from Christine's recollection now looks very similar to the description given by the boys Rod has interviewed. But officers know nothing more. Time is running out, and they have to act fast.
He came back to the car, so they started asking him a couple of questions about the car, where his movements and all that sort of stuff. Then they called Wayne out to take some photos of the car, and he just put this picture together with Christine.
Police waste no time questioning the man about his car.
He was really compliant, actually. He wasn't evasive in any ways, really. He was fairly quiet. John Rain's first priority was, can you open the boot? And he did, because he thought, well, is Ebony still in the boot if this is the car? He was really compliant, he was really calm. So he didn't really raise suspicions, like he wasn't evasive and he wasn't, trying to avoid helping.
Nothing looks immediately suspicious in the boot. But officers know it is essential to get the vehicle to the station for further tests.
I think they said at that stage that we want to use it to take some photographs to put in the media for the news at night, to put this is the type of car that we're looking for the media. That was it wasn't a ploy, but it was a real thing that we were going to do anyway, just in case, because we didn't want to put all the eggs in one basket.
Measures are quickly taken to tow the car to a secure police garage, where forensic searches get underway.
My role with the vehicle was to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and try and identify any physical evidence that may either put Ebony in that car. It might have been biological evidence, it might have been clothing, it could have been school books, anything. I was looking for anything.
As Wayne Day scrutinises the vehicle for any clues, the owner is eager to help with inquiries and agrees to go to the station to answer any questions.
They go inside into the detective's office and So what are we going to do? Asking each other, or as I call it, the hard questions. Do we just go and put it straight on him? Where is she? Because we've still got a missing girl. The criminal investigation at that stage was second priority. The first priority was finding her alive. So, and he was so cool and calm that they had to second guess themselves and think maybe he isn't involved. So we'll just treat him like, you know, a witness about his car, ask him where he's been.
Time is now of the essence. The team need answers. But they are still unsure if this man had anything to do with Ebony's disappearance. As questioning gets underway, they learn more about this local, now identified as Andrew Garforth.
Andrew Peter Garforth, born 5/8/63.
He'd only been in the area a few months. He and his wife had moved to the area. Prior to that, he came from Western Australia. So there really weren't any alarm bells about this guy living in the community or being a threat to kids in the area. Just totally out of the blue, as far as everyone was concerned. And he was married with 2 children and, you know, lived up the road and hadn't been in trouble locally, as far as we know.
With little information on this 29-year-old, the detectives are eager to find out if Garforth has anything to do with Ebony's disappearance.
He just starts asking him questions about what his movements were.
Went to the hardware shop, bought 2 bolts.
He gave an account, pretty much that he'd been to the video store at Tarmore.
What time was it when you left to go to Bargo to the video store?
Yeah, 3:45.
In his account, he avoided saying that he went along Bargo Road and Arena Road.
I drove down Pheasant's Nest Road, turned left onto Nightingale.
Because that would have been the most direct route that he would have taken if he was going into Bargo to return a video or to go to the shop. So after a few more questions, Detective Pateman was just thinking what next to ask him pretty much, and then he goes over the version again. Can you just give me that again? And then he gives a whole different route that he took.
And left onto Arena, right onto Bargo.
Arena Road is the last place Ebony was seen. Garforth's change in his account immediately raises their suspicion.
I'm pretty sure he realised that his movements could be checked about the times because, one, we could have spoken to his wife what time he left, the people at the shop, the video shop.
How long does it take you to drive from your home at Pheasant's Nest to the video store at Bargo?
Roughly 10 minutes.
Officers have only been questioning Garforth for 15 minutes. Nobody could have expected the next words he was to utter.
And when the young girl was walking past the car, we grabbed her between the group.
Over 300 people have now come together in the search for missing schoolgirl Ebony Simpson.
There's nowhere else I can really look because I've searched all the houses around here, most of their properties and that. She'd only get into a car with someone she'd know.
A yellow car on the police radar has been parked just yards away from the command post for most of the search. Officers waste no time in questioning the owner.
Went to the hardware shop, bought 2 bolts.
And could never have imagined what is to unfold.
He starts with, I drove along Bargo Road, I turned onto Arena Road, I stopped to put oil in my car.
I had the bonnet of the car up, I had the boot of the car open.
I was putting oil in the car when the girl walked past.
And when the young girl was walking past the car, we grabbed her between the group.
The detectives are led to believe Ebony never made it beyond the vehicle.
I drove away.
And where did you drive to?
Down Arena.
Now Garforth is calmly reaffirming their worst fears.
And what did she say to you?
She asked me if I was going to let her go, and I said I didn't know.
With this horrifying admission, they are one step closer to uncovering her fate and are now desperate to discover her whereabouts.
He drove Ebony to a bush track down not far away. He went to the back of his car, got some speaker wire, and he tied her hands behind her back and her feet behind her as well, and then tied her feet to her hands. And he just picked her up and threw her in the dam.
I really don't know what my emotions were at that moment in time. I suppose my main concern is, well, we need to try and locate her in case she's still alive. That's probably the most important thing at that stage. There was no mucking around. It's in the cars. Pack up and get to this location.
It is now 11 p.m. Ebony has been missing for over 30 hours. The alert goes out to get to the scene of the crime as quickly as possible. With Garforth willing to show officers the location, they rush to just 6 kilometres from Ebony's home, praying they will find her alive.
We walked up to the dam, and it's something that sticks with me forever, and I get goosebumps talking about it, is walking up over the top of the lip of the dam and seeing the pink lunchbox floating on the water, and the water was like as still, no wind, no movement at all. It was just like glass. As soon as I saw that, I knew she was in there. And we couldn't see her on the banks or anything like that. And yeah, that was probably, it was disappointing. But mind you, with the temperatures in the area at that particular time, she probably wouldn't have survived anyway if she'd been into the water and then come out. She would have been, just the exposure probably would have killed her in any case.
There was no chance that Ebony was still going to be alive because there was no sign of her when she was still in the water, so they could tell that she was thrown, 8 to 10 metres in. There's no way she could make it, and the way she was tied, no way she could make it to the bank.
Ebony Simpson has died at the hands of her brutal attacker in what appears to be an utterly senseless crime. Andrew Garforth stood at the water's edge, describing his actions to police with no remorse whatsoever. Whilst the police and rescue teams have the painful task of recovering Ebony's body, officers are sent to Christine and her family to deliver the heartbreaking news.
I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, the police came, and they'd sent 2 really young policemen up to tell us, and they weren't equipped, And I just remember falling onto the veranda saying, I've got to hold her, let me hold her, She might come back to life if I could hold her. They said, you can't do that.
Nothing can prepare Ebony's family for the other news that is to follow.
In the next interview, he went on that there was more. He actually said that he sexually assaulted Ebony.
I took her up onto the bank of the dam, tied her hands and her feet, pulled her pants down around her ankles, sexually assaulted her, picked her up and threw her in the dam.
I couldn't clean my teeth. I couldn't get out of bed. If it wasn't for my 2 sisters coming and bringing food and feeding my other 2 children and telling me to get up and have a shower and do this, do that, I was a moron. I was a zombie. I just sat and stared. Nothing means anything anymore. All the things about life, that are so precious has just been ripped away from you.
The sexual assault and murder of this defenceless little girl soon shook the whole country and provoked a fierce reaction.
There was community outrage very quickly. From the moment the matter was scheduled for court, there was a large gathering of locals were out the front of the court, and everyone was wild, ropeable.
Keep looking over your shoulder, buddy.
Yelling abuse at Garforth.
We'll tie his arms and legs and see how he goes. Come on, get him here now.
You know, you filthy so-and-so, you die, you pig, and, you know, hang him and all this sort of stuff. It was a real lynch mob stuff. And you couldn't blame them. It was the community venting.
Police waste no time charging Garforth with murder. After this initial appearance, the trial is set, whilst further evidence is gathered, and Ebony laid to rest.
The image that will stay with me for life, apart from the facts of the story, but the image that will stay with me for life is seeing that little coffin. As adults, you go to funerals, you say goodbye to your loved ones, but this wasn't an adult coffin, it was a child's coffin, and that was someone saying goodbye to their child. That there's a little girl who was so brutally murdered and didn't deserve it, and the community was saying goodbye to her.
For the Simpsons, their fight is only just beginning. With a trial to face, they are to never imagine the further pain they will endure.
This man's raped and murdered my daughter. He's a pedophile. The legal system will step in and everything. No, it doesn't. I believed he'd just get locked up for life, but it's not like that. When we were going to court Darlinghurst for the sentencing, they said he'd get 14 to 20 years. I said, not acceptable. I said, that's not acceptable. I said, you can bring back the death penalty, lock him up for the term of his natural life, or I'll get a hitman and blow him away. And, you know, I wasn't joking back then, and I'm still not joking today.
Garforth's unspeakable actions are hard enough to bear, but additional news is to come to light about his movements after he had brutally murdered the little girl.
The perpetrator, the man who'd done this to Ebony, had been up and joined the search party and walked all over our farm, and he knew where she was all the time.
Nine-year-old Ebony Simpson has suffered the most tragic death at the hands of a local paedophile. Missing for over 30 hours, the murderer has calmly admitted to abducting and sexually assaulting the schoolgirl before callously throwing her into a nearby dam. The details of her fate are almost too much to bear, but as her family tries to process the news, they are to endure even further heartache.
They filmed the briefing taking place, and I still remember the footage of Andrew Garforth standing smack bang in the middle of all the people. And there's, I don't know, probably 50 or 60 people standing there having their briefing about to move out to where they were going to search. He was just standing there, standing smack bang in the middle of it.
He joined the search party. I mean, when I think of that today, it makes me nearly sick, you know. We were looking after the person who knew where she was and had already killed her.
How callous can you be to murder a little girl like that and then pretend to search for her? Obviously, it's come out now, or suggested that his Garforth's wife convinced him to join the search party, do the right thing, do the community thing, and he's masqueraded as a searcher for his own victim. That's just unbelievably callous.
As Christine and her family have to consider life without Ebony, they spark a nationwide change in the way victims of crime are dealt with.
We tried to get counselling, and nobody wanted to take us on because I guess she's too hard. How are you going to counsel a family like us? What are you going to tell us? You're going to tell us it's all right and we'll be okay, and if we just do this, that and the other, things will be fine.
I got a phone call from Peter, Ebony's father, and he was really very angry, and he said words to the effect of, you know, everyone else is getting counselling here. We haven't had a phone call from a counsellor. They really wanted something which they deserved, some decent support, professional support, help with their two boys, help with each other.
You got one person in that crazy system in there that just follows the book. You got one person who stepped outside the boundaries, and that was John Merrick, you know, and you don't get that very often.
I can't remember how the idea first crystallised, but it was something like these people might benefit from actually speaking to someone who's been through maybe a similar experience. And there was an old bloke, Gary Lynch, who was the father of Anita Cobby, who was murdered some years prior.
So he introduced us to Anita Cobby's parents, Gary and Peg Lynch, and John and 4 other social workers from Glebe, Coroner's Court, and we got together, and that's how the Homicide Victim Support Group was started.
The Homicide Victim Support Group was formed by Christine, John and a small group of people who sadly have one thing in common. Their initial aim is to help each other and those in similar circumstances. As their work gets underway, Andrew Garforth's highly anticipated trial falls just weeks after and uncovers further evidence towards his guilt.
As it turns out, we had some really, really good evidence. Palm prints on the inner mudguard, inner guard in the boot. I was able to interpret that, which had the child in the car. Was able to reveal finger marks underneath on the underside of the boot lid, and you could see where these hands were scraping on the underside of the boot lid.
The shoe prints in the mud matched to Ebony's shoes. His shoe prints that we got off him on the day. There was blonde hairs in the boot, and he was wearing a woolen jumper. He had a grey woolen jumper. There was one of her hairs on that, or a couple actually, on that jumper. There was a strand of wool from his jumper on a branch at the dam. There was DNA evidence that we obtained from Ebony's body.
All of this extra detail is hugely compelling and weighs heavily in favour of the prosecution. But Garforth himself makes no attempt to plead his innocence.
We didn't need to use all that because he pleaded guilty straight up, pretty much straight away. He pleaded guilty straight up and he was given life in jail.
"11 months after her murder, Ebony Simpson's killer is handed a sentence that will see him die in jail.
Garforth said to his wife, "I'll see you in 14 years." I thought, over my dead body.
The fact remains that Ebony Simpson got the death sentence, the Simpson family's got the life sentence, and Garforth's got bed and breakfast.
He knew the system. He'd been in the system all his life. He knew he'd probably get 14 and be out in 8. So that's how confident he was that he'd played the system over the years. I think people need to understand a lot of this because it's the people who can change the system.
Garforth is familiar with the law, having previous convictions in other parts of Australia for minor crimes. This time, his sentence will match the severity of his crime.
He was one of the very first people in New South Wales to get life meaning life. In the past, life had meant 20 years or so, but here he was one of the first ever in New South Wales to get the newly legislated life meaning life, and without a shadow of a doubt, and there was not one person in New South Wales, I suggest, that thought he wasn't deserving of it.
Garforth will spend the rest of his days behind bars for snatching Ebony from a roadside and killing her in cold blood.
think they think when you go to court and come out and then you just get on with your life. Well, it's not like that, you know? There seems to be there seems to be a lot of rehabilitation for the perpetrators of crime, but there's no rehabilitation for the victims.
In response to her experience, Christine channels her energy into making major changes for victims of crime with the support group.
Well, I think I took all my anger and turned it into something positive and set up Ebony House, first recovery centre in the world for homicide victims. So I burnt up all my angry energy into positive, you know, and I didn't know what else to do with it. Made a lot of changes and very powerful back then.
As a tribute to Christine's daughter, in December 1995, Ebony House is opened for anyone affected by the murder of a loved one, as a place to be able to grieve in private. The support group also goes on to make historic changes.
Police have been taught now at the academy by the homicide victim support group and other folk how to best respond to families, what to say, what not to do, you know, correct procedures. Now that was a real change. Police are very involved and intertwined from the outset with the families and providing them information, updates, details as well, without compromising the investigation as well, without giving stuff away. We've had sentencing submissions and victims' impact statements have made a huge difference as well for families because they feel as though they can be listened to and explain in very personal terms what the murder has meant to them.
I don't think you can make great changes if you haven't felt the pain. It's the pain that drives you. You can feel empathy and try to understand, but you can't feel that power of that wanting change unless it's happened to you.
As the Simpson family has tried to continue with their lives, Garforth has contributed to their ongoing pain since his conviction.
He claims he was bashed in jail, and at one stage he claimed to have lost hearing in one of his ears, and he actually, in many people's eyes, had the tenacity to apply for victims' compensation. Initially he was successful in one of those claims. I think fortunately it was reviewed and overturned, and then the money was offered to charity.
He crossed the lines of what's acceptable with society, you know, and when you cross those lines, and they're precious lines with children, you can't come back into society. You've already isolated yourself. You're not worthy of living in here, around children or women or anything else, you know. So keep him where he is. It's the safest place for him, trust me.
The counselling for Christine and her family was to span many years, and the effort channelled into the victim support group brought about many milestones and legal changes throughout Australia, one of which guarantees that Garforth has no further rights to appeal his sentence.
We changed a lot of things and that was good. But as I've got older, 20 odd years down the track, I have to say the pain's still the same. I'm happy with what's been done, but I've learned to put it somewhere, and I have built a nice life. Doesn't matter what you do in your life, and I've put my life back together, I think, pretty well. But there's a part of my heart that's broken, and I can't fix it. You know? And it doesn't matter how many years go by, how much I talk about it, I can't fix it. And I'm angry about it, you know? I'm angry about what happened to my daughter. I don't want to have people tell me that I shouldn't be angry. I damn well should be angry. A man took my daughter's life and ruined our family. I'm angry, all right, you know. And it's just this stupid system we got out there that says you're supposed to forgive and not be angry. I find it absurd, you know. I mean, if I wasn't angry and upset, I wouldn't be a mother, would I? Put Ebony behind you, move on with your life. No, I'll take her with me and move on with my life. I have no forgiveness whatsoever for what that man did to her. And you can move on. You don't have to forgive to move on. I can see Ebony as plain as anything. She's still 9. I can see her hair. I can see everything about her. I can hear her voice. And no, I can't forgive a person who took that away from our family.
For more than 4 decades, one of Australia's most prolific serial killers, Peter Dupas, preyed on the women of Victoria.
He's driven by dark demons and compulsions we can't even imagine.
This guy is pure evil. His eyes, his demeanour, the way he planned it all.
By 2010, 3 innocent women lay dead at his hands in the most macabre killings the country had ever seen.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked.
Developing sadistic rituals that would stun the nation.
It's the first murder I'd attended and was something I hadn't seen before, there being post-mortem mutilations.
But for years he would evade the necessary justice for his crimes.
He can rot in hell, that's all I want to say.
Only to be finally brought down in one of Australia's most sensational trials, involving a jailhouse confession and $1 million reward, making this a crime that shook Australia. Peter Dupas began his reign of terror over 40 years ago, when he was still just a boy.
Dupas first came to police attention as a 15-year-old, where he attacked his neighbour.
Attempting to stab his victim with a kitchen knife, this terrifying method would become a chilling part of his sexual attacks for many years to come, culminating in 3 innocent women meeting a horrific fate.
You are a psychopath driven by the hatred of women.
When 28-year-old Nikki Patterson failed to meet her friend one evening, nobody could have predicted the horror that was to unfold.
The original job had been called in as a suicide by a girlfriend of Nikki Patterson that turned up to go out for dinner with Nikki. So it had been called in as a suicide, but when the van crew attended and also the local detectives, it became very evident to them that it wasn't a suicide and that Nikki had been murdered and also mutilated.
Police sealed off Harper Street just after 7 o'clock last night when a friend of Nicole Amanda Patterson found her body slumped inside the Northcote house.
A trained psychotherapist and counsellor, Nikki Patterson lived in Northcote, Melbourne.
There's a lot of aspects of Nikki. I guess firstly she was a rogue. She was a bit of a rascal growing up, and she just loved life and loved people. Nikki was at I think, the perfect point in her life. She discovered what she wanted to do and who she was. Prior to that, I think she was trying a number of aspects and found exactly where she wanted to head.
Nikki was keen to choose a career that involved helping other people.
She then joined Ardoc Youth Foundation, which was making sure that underprivileged children received an education. And part of that was housing and, if necessary, and clothing and food. She wanted to utilise her psychotherapy qualification and start helping people with counselling. So she cut down to a 7-day fortnight.
Nikki took the decision to set up her own business with a view to building her clients. As a first step, she placed an advert in a local newspaper.
We'll speak to the family. We started to get the picture together, in fact, that she had just started a career as a psychotherapist, and that would appear to be the first day.
Confronted with a scene of carnage in Nikki's home, officers began their investigations into what could have happened and were quickly given telling clues.
When we started to do the door knocks in the area, it became quite evident that something had occurred that morning. There were a number of witnesses indicated that they'd heard arguments, loud arguments and screaming of a female, but thought it was just a domestic dispute. They sort of gave us a bit of a timeline in relation to what we thought might have occurred. That sort of started our point of reference, and then from there we started to piece everything together.
The murder scene was to hold vital clues for Jeff Marr and his team.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked. She'd been mutilated. And it was obvious to us that there was a sense of some sort of formal meeting of someone because of the tray and the coffee and the plunger and the jug of milk. And the room at the front of the house was set up like a consulting room or some sort of professional room.
Having established her new business from home, it looked like Nikki was preparing for a client when tragedy struck.
We determined we thought that it was in fact probably a client of hers, and that was indication by the relatives. We looked at all the evidence at the time in the house, and we were drawn towards a diary, and in that diary was the word Malcolm and a mobile or a cell phone number.
This diary entry and telephone number were now a major part of the investigation. Who was Malcolm, and what connection did he have to Nikki Patterson?
It was actually owned by an Indian student. He was alibied, and in fact he couldn't give us and help us anymore. So we made some inquiries in relation to the phone numbers that had been ringing Nikki Patterson's house, and we were able to show that in fact another phone number had rung the house, and that phone number was of Peter Dupas.
Peter Dupas was a 46-year-old local man who lived in Pascoe Vale. Checks were quickly made to discover if he had any previous dealings with police.
We did a profile on Peter Dupas, and we discovered that in fact that he was a serial violent predator against women.
The telephone number at Dupas's address had called Nikki's home 15 times over 40 days. Officers wasted no time in tracking him down for questioning.
We decided that we had enough to arrest him. We grabbed him and he was interviewed, and we noticed that on his face was a scratch, and the scratch seemed to us that it looked like it possibly come from a human nail or striking of a nail down her face.
Nikki had met a violent and horrific death. The scratch may have looked suspicious, but the detectives needed more.
We asked him whether he knows Nikki Patterson, whether he in fact had ever been to Harper Street in Northcote, had he ever contacted Nikki Patterson, and it was a negative response to all those questions. He appeared calm. He appeared sort of, I'll describe him as a bit of a Poindexter, a bit of a blancmange, bit of a beige sort of person that seemed to be emotionless.
With little cooperation from Dupas, Jeff and his team rushed to search his home and were confronted with startling evidence.
As we walked into the yard, we saw that the garden hose of the house had been repaired with yellow electrical tape. Now, the relevance of that was because there was small amounts of yellow electrical tape found at the scene in and upon Nicky Patterson's body. So it was very relevant to us.
In the rubbish bin at Peter Dupas's home address when we executed the search warrant, there was a small piece of paper that had been torn up and found at the bottom of his bin, and putting it back together, it actually had Nicky's details and the appointment time and location on the bit of paper.
And it had the word Malcolm written on it, and that was the word and the name of the person that was next to that mobile phone number in her diary for that Monday morning at about 9 o'clock.
Down the bottom of the bin was also a pair of shoes which had blood on the shoes.
We found a kit, we'd call it, with a balaclava and some gloves and some condoms. And then further to that, we also then found a jacket, what you describe as a trucker's jacket, and it had what appeared to us to be blood on the jacket. We further found a newspaper under the sink that had a cut through the face of Nicky Patterson, which was a headline that she'd been brutally murdered.
Within just 3 days of Nicky's violent death, Victoria Police arrested and charged Dupas with her murder.
He gave an alibi at the time that he just sort of filled the vehicle up, he pottered around, did a few odd jobs, and his girlfriend was away at the time and he didn't attend work that day, so he really didn't have an alibi.
Whatever alibi Dupas was to provide, the scientific evidence was to prove overwhelming.
The jacket was important because on the jacket there was a DNA profile of not only Nicky Patterson on the jacket, but also of Peter Dupas, and a combination. We discovered afterward as well, when we collected all the CCTV in the area, that in fact that morning, before he murdered Nicky Patterson, he filled his motor vehicle up with fuel at a local service station, and on the CCTV, you see him paying for the fuel in that green jacket.
The evidence against this vicious predator was now compelling. After a trial lasting 4 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, which was a great relief to the police and the family, who were there every day throughout the trial and remained very strong.
I suppose I felt relief when they caught him. I think I was too shocked to feel anger. I was sort of more saying, he's stolen her, he's a thief, he's stolen my daughter. My family's not whole anymore. They have got the right person, and I wasn't ever in doubt that they didn't have. Well, they just have him off the street, and that he would be punished for the rest of his life.
Peter Dupas was behind bars, but the tragic murder of Nicky Patterson was just the beginning of an insight into this killer's reign of terror. What was to follow would stun the nation.
Dupas, to us, was a violent sexual predator against women. It was quite obvious to us that Nicky Patterson's murder wasn't his first.
Nicky Patterson has met a brutal and violent death in her home at the hands of sadistic murderer Peter Norris Dupas. Having been stabbed 27 times, the killer removed her breasts in an act of utter barbarity. In being handed a life sentence, the nation was to learn the chilling history of this remorseless murderer.
When we started to probe around in relation to who he was, there was a substantial police file on him.
This police file dated right the way back to the early 1970s, almost 30 years before Nicky's death.
I was at Nunawading CIB, and We got a call to attend a place in Mitcham where there was a complaint of a woman who'd been raped. She was at home when a knock at the door, and she answered to see this person who said his car had broken down, and perhaps if he could have the end of a screwdriver that he might be able to fix it. She went off to get the screwdriver, and he came in and grabbed her around the neck.
Just days later, the attacker struck again, nearby.
This particular one, he'd gone to the front door and used exactly the same scenario, that my car's broken down, the bonnet was up again, could I have a screwdriver? The woman there was perhaps a little bit more suspicious. She said to him, well, my husband's coming home shortly, perhaps if you wait he can help you fix the car. And with that, of course, he said, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be right, sort of thing. And he left immediately, over to his car, closed the bonnet, drove off. She got the car number.
With a pattern emerging, a description of a man and a car to go off, Ian Armstrong closed in on a suspect, 21-year-old Peter Dupas.
He had his hands clenched together and he'd sort of be looking down as though trembling, and I thought, this guy's going to crack, you know. He looked as though he was just about on the verge of saying, okay, you got me, sort of thing. And then he'd just sort of look up and, no, I don't know what you're saying. Not me, I wasn't there. It was as though his whole persona changed, and which was quite strange. I'd never come across a person like this. I thought to myself, this guy's different. He's very much different to anybody I'd encountered.
Despite Dupas's denial, his victims successfully identified him in a lineup. A turning point that would see Dupas put behind bars for the first time.
He ended up being convicted of the offence and being sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. I said that the cold calculating way he went about it, the eyes, everything, it all rolled into one to me, saying this guy is evil and, in my opinion, has the ability, especially where females are concerned, to go all the way and to kill.
A chilling warning from a detective decades before that was to sadly come true. A young Peter Dupas first went to prison in 1974, 25 years before the murder of Nikki Patterson. On his release, he committed 4 attacks on separate women over 10 days in 1979, 3 further assaults in 1980, another rape just 4 days after release in 1985, and the false imprisonment of a woman in 1994.
What we're able to establish by looking into his criminal history is he was a man who was a repeat offender, showed no remorse, and I suspect couldn't even help himself.
Shockingly, despite a lifetime behind bars for killing Nikki Patterson, Australia would be plagued by Dupas's heinous crimes for years to come, as more information started to come to light.
We started to investigate previous murders that maybe he fitted the bill with, and that's why a task force was formed. Paul Scarlett went to the task force and they investigated the murder of Margaret Marr.
Margaret Marr had been murdered in 1997, and her case remained unsolved.
Homicide detectives are investigating the discovery of a woman's body in Somerton.
Margaret lived in the Campbellfield area and was well known for plying her trade as a prostitute. She was described as a fairly harmless woman who was only working enough for the purpose of being able to supply a drug addiction. She was well liked in the area, being that she was just a softly spoken, very quiet lady, and would often be seen at the shopping centre just walking around the shops, selecting items off the shelf and then putting them back. I think that was Margaret's way of just some degree of normalcy in her life, and then from there she would go out and continue to work.
40-year-old Margaret Marr's life took a turn for the worse as she entered her adult years.
Margaret came from a very successful family, a very close-knit family. Margaret was certainly a character as a teenager, and in her later years started to run into a little bit of bad luck, mainly because of the people she was associating with at the time.
Margaret worked the streets to feed her drug addiction, and in 1997, tragedy struck.
Margaret's body was located in Somerton at about 6:30 in the morning by a man and his wife who were collecting cans to raise funds for a charity, I believe. And he saw the pile of computer components and boxes lying in that area and lifted one of them and found Margaret's body underneath.
Margaret had been choked to death, mutilated, and had one of her breasts removed. But despite many police hours, the investigation into her horrific murder ran cold.
There was no new information coming forward, and the difficulty was because of Margaret's past behaviour and her lifestyle. She was a prostitute, she was a drug user, her health was not good, she had some issues health-wise. So the investigators initially couldn't take it anywhere, and the investigation was filed.
But more than 7 years on from her murder, officers would uncover a terrifying link to Nikki Patterson that would blow the case wide open again.
There were only 2 murders recorded in Australia in the last 10 years where breasts had been removed post-mortem, and that was Nicole Patterson, which Peter had already been convicted for, and Margaret Marr.
The brutal murder of Margaret Marr in October 1997 devastated her family and puzzled the police. With few witnesses and little to go off at the scene, the trail for the killer ran cold. Yet years later, with the violent death of another woman, Nikki Patterson, officers would find themselves back on the hunt for Margaret's killer, after a chilling discovery that linked both women.
The injuries sustained to her were very similar to Nikki. In fact, so similar, when we started to review that investigation, we went to the Homicide Monitoring Unit in Canberra, and I gave them parameters of searching murders nationally, and I think the figures were up around 2 in 10,000 murders nationally that had similar wounds inflicted.
The 2 in 10,000 were Nikki and Margaret. This bizarre mutilation had only happened to these 2 women. It was so rare, it led only to one man, Peter Dupas. But detectives needed to build the case further.
When Margaret's body was located, there were a number of boxes and computer components that were tipped on top of the body. So obviously a lot of that was re-examined, and there was also a female's glove located nearby, and that was tested back in 1997 with the technology that was available then, and we had that glove retested in 2001, and at that time the scientists lifted DNA from inside one of the finger holes of the glove.
This DNA was a massive breakthrough and matched with their prime suspect, Dupas. The chances of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 450,000.
We used the DNA evidence and similar fact evidence to complete a brief of evidence against Peter Dupas.
Our argument was that the person that did this was one and the same person as the person that had murdered Nicole Patterson, because we said he had a signature, that is the removal of the breast or breasts in the case of Nicole Patterson. You need an unusual feature or an underlying methodology or practice, and we had that.
The argument against Dupas appeared to be mounting, but in opening the case once more, it also reopened wounds for Nikki Patterson's family.
We had to suspend Margaret's trial and effectively reopen Nicole's murder trial and prove that murder to this jury.
It was extremely hard, the Margaret Marr trial. During the trial for Nikki, I was in too much shock, and I sat out on a lot of the parts that were going to be too hard. But this time I sat there and made most of it. There was one instance where they showed video of Nikki in her lounge room, and when they panned around onto her face and her eyes were open, I just walked straight out. You know, that was pretty horrific.
The eventual trial for the murder of Margaret Marr was heard 7 years after her death. Despite the evidence against him, Dupas still mounted a defence.
The defence mentioned that breast mutilation or genital mutilation was a common event during the Vietnam War and with Jack the Ripper. So their defence was that it was not an unusual event and shouldn't be considered as a unique set of circumstances here in Australia.
After a highly charged trial lasting 3 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter Dupas was again sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Margaret Marr. We felt relieved for the family.
Dupas was now known as one of Australia's most barbaric killers. His depravity held no bounds, taking one of Nikki's body parts after his chilling attack and leaving Margaret with her breast forced into her mouth. With his crimes recorded from the age of just 15, his macabre attacks had escalated over the years, culminating in 2 horrific murders. With such a history, could there be more victims?
Well, it was All Saints' Day, and Messina had gone out in her boyfriend's car to the cemetery to tend to her grandmother's grave.
Messina Halvargis was a 25-year-old bank worker who lived in Mentone with her parents.
Messina was a lovely young girl who lived a very, I'd say, modest life, very respectful young girl.
On the afternoon of Saturday, the 1st of November, Messina took the decision to go to Fawkner Cemetery, a vast graveyard in the suburbs of Melbourne. Having bought flowers nearby, she made her way to the Greek Orthodox section.
A slightly built, fragile woman tending her grandmother's grave and, you know, doing the right thing, doing the family responsibility and doing the right and the moral thing.
As Messina knelt down to tend to her grandmother's grave, the unthinkable happened.
She was attacked viciously and repeatedly near the grave, murdered, dragged up into an area between 2 graves and left there. Messina had been reported missing by her boyfriend and her father, and eventually the trail led back to the cemetery where the vehicle's located, the boyfriend's vehicle's located, and the scene was discovered.
When she failed to return in her fiancé's car, he and his father went to investigate and found the vehicle still parked at the cemetery.
Messina sustained a brutal and frenzied attack, suffering more than 80 stab wounds throughout her body. With such a violent and what appeared to be senseless attack, news quickly spread throughout the community as police tried to catch her murderer.
So far, there are no clues to the motive for the killing.
And we're not discounting the fact that it was a random attack.
There was huge media interest because of the circumstances and the style of murder. We had to track whether or not there was anything in the background of Messina that could take us down a path of issues specifically relating to her, and that wasn't the case.
Before long, information started to flood in.
On the days leading up to the murder, we had a number of women that made statements in relation to being approached by a person, and it showed that he was in the cemetery and stalking these women. I was lucky that they weren't victims of the particular crime that unfortunately fell upon Messina.
During that first period at the crime scene, a lady came forward and provided a face-fit identification diagram. We had it, but it didn't take us any further.
The lady, Mrs. Berman, mentioned a man she had spoken to in the cemetery on the same day as the murder. Acting strangely, she made a note of what he looked like and what he wore, but officers needed more. Over the coming months, Victoria Police would gather over 1,000 statements and interview anybody who might help with their investigation. But this was all to be to no avail.
Our investigations kept going on that, but we weren't having any breakthrough.
This frustration, coupled with no forensic evidence for Greg and his team to go off, meant they were no closer to finding out who had attacked Messina and why. Seven years on from Messina's murder, Paul Scarlett and his colleagues had just put the killer of Margaret Marr behind bars.
We then commenced looking into Messina's case, try and open up other avenues of inquiry which hadn't yet been explored or properly developed. There were hundreds of information reports created by people trying to assist police. Many exhibits were taken from the Faulkner Cemetery: cigarette butts, tyre impressions, prints, samples, witnesses being spoken to, recanvassed, door knocks conducted, media releases.
The hunt for Messina's killer was once again a major focus for Victoria Police, with the government even stepping in with one of the highest rewards ever offered in the country.
In February 2005, the Victorian government released a $1 million reward for any information leading to the capture and conviction of the person or persons responsible for the murder.
This massive financial commitment was pushed with the determination of Messina's family, especially her father, George.
Originally there was a $50,000 reward offered in the case of her murder, but George turned himself into a one-man lobby group, and he went to the government and he got 100,000 and finally, ultimately, $1 million.
With the case now firmly back in the public conscience, the investigation was to take a surprising turn.
There was a turning point when the reward money was released as a result of a couple of witnesses coming forward. That, and also making contact with a man called Andrew Fraser.
Andrew Fraser was the underworld's lawyer of choice for many years. He was a hard man for hard jobs.
Andrew Fraser, who was a disgraced lawyer at the time, doing time for drug trafficking, and he had in fact done time with and being in prison with Peter Dupas.
Andrew Fraser was on my list of people to contact, and I left him till last because I really didn't think I'd get any joy. But to my surprise, when I did contact him, he said, "You better come and see me."
One of Australia's most dangerous men, Peter Norris Dupas, is serving 2 life sentences for the murder and mutilation of Nikki Patterson and Margaret Marr. But other questions still remain unanswered. After 7 years, the investigation into the horrific murder of Messina Halvagis had stalled, until a new lead came from somewhere they could never have expected.
Andrew Fraser was one of Australia's top criminal defence lawyers, but convicted of smuggling cocaine, found himself face to face with Dupas in prison.
Andrew Fraser was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, and that's where Peter Dupas was being housed at that time. Andrew made contact with Peter, particularly Peter, because he was the one that he feared the most, and he wanted to have Peter on side.
Fraser obviously had something to say. Could he provide the missing link officers had been searching for?
I left Melbourne that night and spoke to Andrew Fraser in person at the prison the very next morning.
Paul Scarlett could never have imagined what was to follow.
Andrew alleges that there was one occasion when he and Peter were walking around the garden area of the prison, and a prisoner from another area approached the cyclone fence and yelled obscenities to Peter, saying, "You killed my cousin, Messina." And Peter's responded in a rather colourful way, and then turned around to Fraser and said, "How does that so-and-so know what I've done?" When they were in the garden working, and Fraser has allegedly dug up a knife or a shiv in the garden area and shown it to Peter, and Peter has held the knife in his hands, almost balanced the knife in his hands and mentioned the word Messina, or the name Messina, on a couple of occasions, and has then got rid of the knife. In one particular meeting that Andrew Fraser had with Peter, he was discussing the prosecution case, or the brief that I had served on him in jail for the murder of Margaret Marr. And Fraser argued with Dupas about the DNA that police had found inside the glove, and Fraser said, "You told me there was no DNA left at the scene." And they then got onto the discussion about Messina Helvargas's crime scene, and Dupas responded by saying, "I left no DNA at that scene."
Andrew Fraser was providing the police with explosive information, and more was to come.
Fraser spent a significant time with Peter in his cell talking about general matters, and on one occasion when they were watching television, George Helvargas was making a public plea for Dupas to talk to police, and on this occasion Dupas clamped both of his hands together and started staring into space, rocking backwards and forwards, and Fraser asked him what was wrong, and Dupas then turned off the television.
He actually mimed the murder, showing himself creeping up on somebody and stabbing them in a way that only the police would know was actually right.
This flood of new information could have been the turning point officers desperately needed. It had been 8 years since Messina's death and had cost thousands of man-hours. Now they were potentially one step closer to connecting Dupas to the murder.
I was absolutely relieved to get that information from Andrew Fraser, and I knew that that's all we needed to go to court. We had enough.
But the offer of this priceless information came with a condition.
Andrew agreed to give this information as evidence in court only on the condition that he was released from prison. I did what's called a petition of mercy to the state government to try and get Andrew Fraser out of prison so that I could commence the trial for Messina Helvargas.
It took Scarlett over a year to get Fraser out of prison. But once he was a free man, it was time to go to court.
Andrew Fraser was released from prison at about 5:30 one particular morning, and by 10 o'clock that morning I was charging Dupas with murder. Can you tell me please your full name and address?
Peter Norris, Dupas, Bowen Prison.
Peter was surprised to see me, but just made a no comment interview and wouldn't cooperate. I put it to you that Messina was stabbed to death whilst tending to the Faulkner Cemetery in Melbourne. Do you know the incident that I'm talking about? Okay.
Paul and I spoke to George Helvargas and the family about it, that we were in fact charging Dupas with the murder. It was a pretty good day for the Helvargas family and a pretty good day for us.
One of the most highly anticipated trials in Australian criminal history was to get underway at the Supreme Court in Melbourne, and Andrew Fraser was to be one of the key witnesses.
I did everything I could to corroborate the information that Andrew Fraser gave to me through prison records of including prisoner movement, and I was able to do that to a degree. But the pantomime, obviously, I'm never going to be able to prove that to a court.
In July 2007, a packed court heard the evidence presented by Andrew Fraser. Has he acted out what Dupas had done in prison, or the pantomime? Other crucial witnesses also took to the stand.
Mrs. Berman made a photo fit. We were challenged that it was made up, but bearing in mind that Mrs. Berman made that face identification in early 1998, and we didn't get those photos of Peter Dupas into our possession until April 1999. So there's absolutely no way that the allegations put to us could have ever occurred.
Another vital part of the jigsaw was now available. Dupas's jacket, found with Nicky's blood on, matched a description Mrs. Berman had given in the cemetery years before, strongly suggesting he wore it during both murders. The defence for Dupas questioned the evidence, even arguing that Messina's fiancé could have harmed her. All the while, the killer, now in court for a third murder, sat giving nothing away.
Dupas always has the same attitude in court. He will just sit there silent, staring straight ahead. Occasionally he will glare at somebody.
After a tense 22-day trial, the verdict was announced.
He was convicted. He received life no minimum for the murder of Messina.
It was just a great sense of relief for the Hellvargas family and the Patterson family that were there every day with the Hellvargases. Just a great sense of relief.
I think just being there and for them knowing that I understand how they feel. Well, I don't think I ever will understand, because I had 3 days of not knowing. They had 10 years before it went to trial.
Dupas had finally been handed the justice he had long deserved. But this victory was to be short-lived.
Dupas appealed the conviction on the basis of reliability and credibility of witnesses that had identified Dupas from the front pages of the local newspapers, and also the defence raised the issue that they didn't believe Dupas could ever get a fair trial because of the media notoriety of his crimes and his history, criminal history.
To many people's disbelief, the appeal was upheld. This devastating blow meant the guilty verdict for Messina's murder was quashed.
We're just devastated, that's all.
A decision that shocked the nation. A retrial was ordered, meaning police, family and witnesses had to endure the legal process once more.
With the first Messina Hellvargas trial, I was not involved in the prosecution of that. But essentially, in the second prosecution, we relied on the same evidence, in the main.
The witnesses once again took to the stand, along with Andrew Fraser, who recounted what Dupas had done in prison.
He's jumped up and gone like that, pointing at the wall, and I'm sitting here, so he's turned around, and then he indicated himself, and then he started the flailing motion as if stabbing somebody.
The retrial lasted 26 days.
He was convicted again and he appealed. That appeal was knocked back. Dupas will now spend the rest of his days in jail where he belongs.
The family were very much looking forward to spending their Christmas together for the first time since Messina's tragic death, with this issue now behind them.
Andrew Fraser has now received some of the $1 million reward.
Quite frankly, he deserves it because the Director of Public Prosecution said that without him, there would have been no trial and therefore no conviction.
The infamous reign of terror by Peter Norris Dupas has spanned 4 decades, cost thousands of police hours and much heartache for victims and their families. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
The judge said the question remained of how did Dupas come to be how he is. His actions were not explained by mental illness, drugs, childhood or other trauma, but driven by a deep-seated hatred of women.
But despite some closure for Nikki, Margaret and Messina's families, it isn't the end.
We believe he's the suspect in a number of other murders going back to the early 80s. Helen McMahon at the Rye Back Beach in the 80s was murdered, and we believe he's a person of interest in that. The Kathleen Downs murder at a nursing home at Brunswick, and also the murder of Renita Brunton, who was killed in a clothing store in Sunbury.
Peter Dupas is the criminal who won't go away.
I've seen a lot of homicides and charged a lot of offenders, but can I tell you that Dupas is a very, very evil person.
I'm no expert on the conscience of Peter Dupas, but I suspect he hasn't got one. Will he ever confess? I suspect not.
You can't even get any sense of what's going on in his head. The corners of evil in his mind are just beyond comprehension.
He's driven by things he doesn't even understand. So he's in jail to punish him? Not really. It won't stop him. It's to protect us.
On the 28th of April 1996, the historic tourist site of Port Arthur in Tasmania became the scene of the largest massacre ever to hit Australia.
Aussie officials are calling it the worst massacre in over 100 years.
There was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Within minutes, a gunman rampaged through the site, shooting at innocent people.
I've not seen injuries like that. There is such destruction from this sort of weapon.
The mother was carrying the 3-year-old baby when they were both shot.
The scale of the deaths and injuries that was to follow rocked the world.
Those scenes were simply horrific, and I have an extraordinary amount of admiration for everybody that had to confront those scenes on the day.
35 people were shot and killed, and 23 wounded.
I've never been involved in war, but I could think of nothing that would describe an incident such as that inside this place as the product of war.
I felt when I left Port Arthur that I had to do something.
The devastation wreaked by the mass murderer and the colossal change the tragedy provoked makes this a crime that shook Australia.
I was working. I started at 9 that morning because there wasn't many staff on. It was a really busy day.
The picturesque tourist site of Port Arthur sits on the Tasman Peninsula, an integral part of Australian history, ever since the British convicts were first shipped there in the 18th century.
Back in those days, the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. It was a military reserve. You weren't allowed on the peninsula unless you had business there. It was run by the soldiers and Governor Arthur.
The historic site is relatively beautiful in the sense that much of it still survives. Some of it's been restored. So it has that interesting combinations of trees and plants that you would find in the United Kingdom that, of course, are not native in Tasmania. Port Arthur is always on the list of places to go with anybody that visits us.
On the morning of the 28th of April 1996, Ian Kingston, along with 30 staff at Port Arthur, were preparing to welcome many tourists.
There was a lot of the management side of the organisation. We were at a seminar on the east coast of Tasmania, Bicheno, and it's how come I ended up here on the day. It became obvious by about 11 that it was going to be more busier than what they predicted. I think we had 14 coaches end up coming in. Car parking was getting a bit of an issue because visitor centres there now wasn't there in those days. Everyone used to park under the oak trees and, you know, it was really limited.
One of the tourists visiting the site that day was Peter Croswell.
At the time, I was the state manager of an organisation called Camp Quality. It was a support program for kids with cancer and their families.
Peter's role that day was to look after other people visiting from the organisation. They chose a day out at Port Arthur.
We had one team at that particular time that had developed the program that were based in Sydney, and they actually come over to Tasmania to do their first tour here. And it so happened that that weekend they'd been here a week, going around the primary schools, and they wanted to go down to Port Arthur. So I took them down there for the day.
Just 3 kilometres up the road from the tourist site, a local man, Martin Bryant, arrived at Seascape, a popular guest house run by David and Sally Martin. As people started to filter in to Port Arthur, Ian, one of the site's support staff, fielded the many vehicles packed with tourists.
I was sort of coordinating parking around lunchtime when Martin Bryant drove in.
Martin Bryant was a 28-year-old man from Newtown, Hobart. Like all the other tourists that day, Ian Kingston believed he was there to have a look around.
Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured. When he drove in on the day, he wanted to park down near the jetty, and I pointed out to him that he couldn't do that because there was already about 8 coaches there. So he said, "Oh, can I park in front of the information centre?" And I said, "Well, it's better if you park along under the trees, under the oak trees." He wanted to get on the 1:30 ferry. And I said, "Well, you'll have to get a boarding pass from the information centre." He tried to get on the boat, couldn't get on. So he got back in the car and went and parked down in amongst all the coaches where we didn't want him to park anyway. I watched him do that. He sat there for half a minute. He got out of his car. On the back seat of his car he had like a golf bag type of thing, big bag. I saw that as he drove in. Anyway, he mucked around the back seat, got this bag out, put it on his shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really take a lot of notice of it. Then he went in the boot and he was mucking around in the boot of the car. That took him a couple of minutes, fiddling with there, doing whatever he had to do. Then he walked up to the cafe.
The Broad Arrow Cafe was situated just up from the car park and the water's edge, across from the main penitentiary ruins.
He went in the front door and he was probably in there for a few minutes. might have been 10, 15, something.
As Ian continued to help other tourists, Bryant ate his meal on the deck and then went back inside. What was to happen next would change Australia forever.
And all of a sudden, I could hear this bang, bang, bang. I could see dust coming out of the building from where I was looking. And I thought, what's going on? I started to make my way up there. It's still going. I thought, God, must be a bloody electrical fault. Anyway, I ran in the building, and as I went in the door, there was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Tasmania's main tourist attraction, Port Arthur, is under siege. Ian Kingston, one of the staff members, has been helping tourists throughout the morning as the site gets busier. After hearing loud noises from the cafe, he rushes to investigate and could never have prepared for what he was confronted with.
I got inside the building and there's Bryant standing with his gun, and beside him over a bit he had his big bag that he had on his back, and I could see in the bag that there was other gun of some description.
Ian faced an unprecedented situation. Martin Bryant had opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon in the busy cafe, giving the innocent customers and staff little time to react. Peter Croswell was also there with his party.
You can't comprehend. You're sitting on this beautiful April day, it's quite cool, sitting down for a cup of coffee, and then somebody starts coming and shooting people. It doesn't make sense.
The cafe and adjoining gift shop were crowded with more than 60 customers and staff when Bryant opened fire.
It takes time to react to it. You can't think it through, you just react to it. And some people reacted by running, other people reacted by hiding in cupboards.
As the cold-blooded killer indiscriminately shot at anyone in his path, Peter made the split-second decision to try to shield his colleagues from the gunfire.
I reacted in a different way. It's not a weakness, not strength. It's just the way you react, given that. And a lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
As Peter took cover and the gunman continued his rampage, Ian Kingston witnessed the horror from the doorway.
There was a person to the left of me. They went to move and he turned around and shot the guy. And then while I was there, this chap behind him, he got up and moved his chair and he turned around and shot two more people then. And while he had his back to me, I got out.
In the space of just 90 seconds, Martin Bryant had shot and killed 20 people, injuring a further 12. As Ian rushed away from the cafe to warn others and get them to safety, some tourists hadn't yet realised a killer was on the loose.
By that time, we had a couple of coachloads of American tourists, and they thought it was just some sort of a show. And they were all flocking from out on the oval and all around the whole site to see what was going on. And like I was sort of didn't know what to do.
With no signs of relenting, Bryant continued shooting in the cafe and gift shop.
I got as many as I could together in the bunch, and we started to make our way up through Government Gardens past the fountain to the parsonage. That's where I was bringing them to, so it's pretty safe.
As Ian desperately gathered as many people as he could to run to safety, the gunman started to move outside, where many unwitting tourists still had no idea what was happening.
It's gunshots, live action here at Port Arthur.
I looked around and I saw him come out of the cafe, and he came out and he shot a couple of shots across over the oval towards the penitentiary.
Tourists and staff tried to take cover as the cold-blooded killer headed back towards the car park. In just seconds, he took aim at people as they ran for their lives or hid for safety on the parked vehicles. Nobody was spared. Meanwhile, Ian Kingston could see the tragedy unfold as he battled to get his group to safety.
We were bringing all these people up to the parsonage, and we had the Mikacs with us. She decided she didn't want to be part of our group. It was too dangerous. She was going to leave the site. Anyway, at that point I saw him come off the bus, and I said to her, "Stay with us, he's getting in the car." No, she said, "I'm going to run up the road."
The Mikacs were a young family. Nanette and her two girls, Madeline, aged 3, and Alana, 6, visiting the site that day. Despite Ian's desperate pleas, Nanette was frantic to get her children to safety and took the decision to try and escape alone.
The Mikacs, they wanted to go home, and that was where we lost them. They just veered off and unfortunately went the wrong way.
As the family ran out of Port Arthur, Bryant also made his way off the site. He had just shot at 11 innocent people in and around the car park and jetty. The carnage and devastation left many severely wounded and others dead.
Got in the car, drove out, headed up out of the site. At the top of the site there used to be the toll booth was there where everyone paid their money. He was about halfway up and he started shooting. I thought, oh, he's probably shot the kids and all that.
Ian feared for the safety of the Mikacs. Having made the decision to leave at the same time as Bryant, they were right in his path. The gunman drove up to the family, just a few hundred meters from the exit, and stopped beside them, shooting the mother dead, before turning the gun on Madeline and Alana.
How dare someone murder 2 little kids after murdering their mother and chase one of them round a tree to kill her? It just beggars belief.
The enormity of the massacre was now unparalleled. A lone killer had started a callous rampage with apparently no motive. Now more than 20 people lay dead and over a dozen wounded. And the nightmare didn't appear to be ending. On seeing the brutal killings of the Mikacs, other tourists quickly hurried to get out of Bryant's path, warning anyone they could to turn back. By now, the gunman was already back in his car and making his way to the toll booth.
At that point, I heard some more shooting on top of the hill. You know, I rang the toll booth, Aileen was in there, and I told her, you know, lay on the floor. She said, all the money, we're counting the money. So, and I said, don't worry about the bloody money, just get down because he's coming back. So she just laid on the floor.
Martin Bryant had in fact murdered 4 friends at their car, pulling their bodies out of the vehicle and into the road before stealing it. The killer then drove to a local service station, targeting another car that was about to leave. The couple in the vehicle had no chance to escape. The female passenger was shot as she tried to flee, whilst the man was forced at gunpoint into the boot of the stolen car. Bryant now had a hostage. An unprecedented tragedy has happened at Port Arthur in Tasmania. A lone gunman has opened fire at the popular tourist attraction, shooting innocent visitors and staff. Dozens lie dead and severely injured as the killer continues his rampage out of the sight and along the road at a service station.
What happened was that after Bryant left and continued his shooting rampage up the road, you could still hear the gunshots.
And the gunfire could be heard across the site as Ian rushed to get his group away from the danger.
Yeah, the parsonage would be about 300 metres from the cafe.
On the left.
It's the longest 300 metres ever I've walked in my whole life. It was a bit of an issue to get everyone up there as quickly as we could. As the afternoon went on, the whole phone network got clogged. It was hard, and it was hard trying to pacify visitors that were here that couldn't ring out. Couldn't get a line, trying to tell people their families overseas, they're all okay.
As the survivors waited for help, Bryant was still on the loose. After taking a hostage prisoner in the boot of his car, he drove to a place he had already been to that day, Seascape Guest House. By now, emergency services had been alerted to the tragedy and were rushing to the numerous crime scenes unfolding. Terry McCarthy was a trained negotiator with Tasmania Police.
The initial call I got was extraordinarily brief. It said something along the lines of 20 dead at Port Arthur, get here now. My initial task was to try and make contact with Seascape to establish who was there and perhaps ascertain what was going on.
Whilst officers were getting into position, news of the horror was filtering through to forensic psychiatrist Ian Sale.
I heard vaguely this news flash about shootings.
At least 200 police have surrounded Port Arthur. All roads in have been blocked.
I thought, my heavens, this is happening here. I knew because I'd done occasional call-outs with the police negotiator squad. I got a telephone call from a police officer I know to ask if I could come in and lend a hand.
Information was now trickling through to Terry and Ian about the enormity of the killer's rampage. At this point, they had no idea of what to expect from this gunman. He had already callously murdered dozens of people and showed no signs of stopping.
He talked about a vehicle that was burning on the property and sort of kept asking, why aren't we doing anything about it? And it was like he'd set that fire to force police to come in to investigate what was going on. And of course, he'd set himself up to ambush those police officers should they go in there.
With a burning vehicle in front of the building, Terry had to be mindful not to rush in and put officers' lives in danger. The police also faced another challenge.
Two of my colleagues were stuck in a ditch across the road under fire, and part of my role, of course, was to keep Bryant occupied, engaged in conversation so that some sort of action could be taken to perhaps get those guys out.
The trapped officers had been the first on the scene at the guest house. Unaware of the scale of the danger, they had to take cover as he shot at them from inside the house.
It was difficult to work out exactly what weapons Bryant had. But certainly the vehicle that he'd travelled down to the historic site was subsequently located, and it was established that there were a number of weapons still in the boot of that vehicle, along with a significant quantity of ammunition. So we knew he had access to high-powered, high-capacity magazine firearms, but as to where they came from, we weren't sure at that particular stage. He was able to fire significant numbers of rounds in the general direction of police officers on the ground.
As Terry tried to get any information from Bryant, investigations were underway to try and find out who this gunman was and what possible motive he could have to cause such heartache.
I'd never heard of Bryant before the day, and on the day, the information we got in, they were able to eventually identify who he was, and then they were able to identify family members. But the information that family members gave us was confusing. We were initially told that Bryant had schizophrenia, but the conversations that he was having with the police certainly didn't suggest schizophrenia, and it's not the sort of incident you would expect a person with schizophrenia to cause. But nonetheless, we were faced with that sort of information and trying to make sense of that.
With limited information on this volatile character, the police were desperate to get answers from Bryant and to try and stop any further bloodshed. But Terry McCarthy didn't receive the response he anticipated.
You're expecting a structured conversation and a belief by the other person that they have some goal that they want to achieve, whereas we just seem to be going through motions. It was clear that Martin Bryant really didn't have a plan, and as a consequence of that, the negotiations didn't develop in the direction that one would expect them to develop. So our focus became to establish whether there was anybody in the stronghold with him and to convince him to surrender himself without any further harm.
As the siege at the guest house appeared to be at stalemate, the hours since the initial shootings were passing by, and news of the mass killings was now spreading as medical teams desperately battled to save the victims.
It was about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, and my wife told me that the switchboard at the Royal had rung and that there was a major disaster.
Steve Wilkinson was head of surgical specialties at the Royal Hobart Hospital at the time.
We knew that at that stage there were going to be multiple casualties, so we formed small trauma teams. We had to clear out an entire ward of patients that were already there. We had to either send them home or move them out to other wards. We didn't know how many people were coming in. It could have been 10 or it could have been 100. We just didn't know.
With the hospital on red alert, casualties soon started arriving with varying degrees of wounds. Peter Croswell, who had shielded his colleagues in the cafe, was taken in to be treated.
There were a couple of us, like myself and my 2 working mates, who got fragments of bullets and all that type of stuff.
In trying to save his friends and dodge the gunfire, Peter was shot.
The place was so sombre, as you can imagine. It was like being in a morgue in the hospital. It was shocking. But not many people stayed there for very long. I think there was 2 or 3 of us in there for 4 or 5 days.
As Peter was treated, Steve Wilkinson and his team were trying to establish the scale of everyone's wounds.
I've got to say that I've not seen injuries like that. We see gunshots and stabbings from time to time, but there is such destruction from this sort of weapon that, there's just loss of tissue. So, there was a lot of, major sort of surgery required.
Meanwhile, 95 kilometres away at Seascape Guest House, the negotiation team was trying to establish if Bryant had injured anyone else inside. David and Sally Martin, the 2 owners, hadn't been seen for hours.
During those limited communications, we heard no sounds of life other than Bryant. And it's one of the reasons you have these negotiations. You're trying to work out what else is going on in their environment.
Bryant mentioned how he was preparing food for hostages, but the negotiators couldn't determine whether he was bluffing or telling the truth. And other information he was providing just didn't add up.
The way he spoke was more like a young teenager rather than an adult male. He was telling us stuff that was completely false. He said he'd been out surfing or something like that, and it was complete nonsense. So there wasn't anything useful happening in that communication.
We didn't establish that rapport because there was no rapport to establish. He was in denial as to what had occurred in terms of he wasn't even making reference to what had occurred at the historic site. He was talking about some fanciful event that he claimed had occurred at another location at Fortescue Bay, which is also on the peninsula. It was like a bad script that he was operating on.
And the situation was about to get worse.
What we weren't aware of at that particular time was that the only phone within the Seascape property was a battery-operated cordless phone. We were aware that he was using that phone, but we didn't have the knowledge that there wasn't a backup landline phone that he could pick up in the event that that went flat. So that created some problems for us when, of course, it was apparent that the battery had gone flat. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get a telephone into a situation like that safely?
After hours of attempts to get some breakthrough with Bryant, the telephone line had gone flat. They were no closer to a peaceful resolution and had no idea if the hostages were safe.
When the communications broke down, it was decided that the negotiator unit would move down to a place called Turana, which is about 5 or 6 kilometres north of Seascape. And they set up a operations area there, and various attempts were made to try and get the communication going again with Bryant, but they were all unsuccessful. They weren't able to find a way.
As daylight broke the following morning, the killer had been holed up in the guest house for 18 hours. What happened next was to stun the officers as Bryant made his next move.
The next morning, he decided to set fire to the property.
Port Arthur in Tasmania has just experienced one of the worst human atrocities in Australian criminal history. A lone gunman, Martin Bryant, has walked into a tourist attraction with a semi-automatic gun and shot at innocent people. In an attack lasting 15 minutes, over 30 victims have been killed and dozens injured. More than 18 hours on from the tragedy, the killer is still hiding in a guest house nearby with possible hostages. Negotiators have lost communication after the phone line went flat, and whilst they try to re-establish connection, Bryant changes tack once more.
He'd set fire to Seascape and then was eventually forced out by the fire.
I'm not sure why he did that. I suspect he was trying to have police take some action. That didn't occur, of course, and as a result, I think he found it a bit difficult inside, perhaps getting himself burnt. He was arrested a short period of time later when he escaped from the house.
With Seascape in flames, emergency services rushed to the aid of any hostages that might have been inside, whilst Bryant was taken to hospital.
I personally was keeping an eye on the news, and we saw that the house that he was holed up in went up in flames and that he'd been captured, and so we knew he was coming. We wound up the burns unit to receive him, and he was brought in under pretty tight security. We gave the medical and nursing staff the option of treating him or not being involved in his treatment. He had quite significant burns, and that took a while to sort those out.
Back at the guest house, officials battling the blaze were to encounter more devastation as 3 bodies were discovered. One victim was Glenn Pears, the man he had taken hostage at the service station. The others were David and Sally Martin, the owners of Seascape.
He broke off communication at one stage and said he was going to prepare food for the hostages. But I suspect, in retrospect, that the hostages were dead by then.
Officers were to also discover that Bryant's rampage had begun before arriving at Port Arthur, visiting Seascape on the morning of the tragedy and killing the Martins. But why had he singled those out?
I believe he held a grudge against the people who ran the B&B, and that's probably where it started, that grudge. I suspect that he held them in part responsible for his father's death. The death of his father is probably the central matter. His father committed suicide in a farm dam, and the family say that he was distressed by this. I believe that he suspected that his father died because of a dispute with the people who owned Seascape. I think that's probably the heart of what happened, and it started off as revenge towards them.
Martin Bryant's father, Morris, had previously tried to buy the guest house. Yet the Martins secured it first, allegedly creating stress for the Bryant family. But if this was the catalyst in sending the gunman over the edge, why did he target all the other innocent victims too?
I think that what happened then at Broad Arrow, he expected to be stopped. He thought, just like Hollywood, that there'd be some hero with a gun there who'd cut him down. But it didn't happen. There was no one there. So this was an incident that, once it got that far, he wasn't able to stop. It wasn't scripted for him. And I just think it sort of got there by accident. He didn't know what to do and just kept on going.
As Bryant was treated for his burns, Ian Sale and colleagues tried to dig deeper into his background for any insight.
They were able to retrieve his hospital record, and we learned from that he'd recently been in hospital for quite a serious injury in a motor vehicle accident, and they had noticed some oddness about his behaviour, but had been assured by family that he's got schizophrenia. We also went to the house in Newtown where he'd been living, but that was confusing too. He'd been living there with this rather eccentric woman, and the house was certainly eccentric. She was a hoarder and a collector, and that showed in the house. It was a very, very weird house, to be honest.
The woman who Bryant had lived with was Helen Harvey, a friend who had died in the car accident that injured Bryant 4 years before. Her death resulted in him inheriting a substantial amount of money.
For various reasons, he'd come into a lot of money. He was unrestrained. The people who had some degree of control over him, his father, Mrs. Harvey, with whom he lived, they were both dead. It was mayhem because he could do whatever he liked. And he did.
Bryant had in fact inherited an estate worth millions of dollars. But this didn't answer the questions now being raised on how he managed to get hold of the guns in the first place.
As far as I'm aware, Bryant bought one of his weapons through a classified ad. Another one he bought from a dealer who had a shop about 2 blocks away. No one knew that he had these weapons.
Bryant had bought an array of semi-automatic weapons with ease, no questions asked. He held no license or authorization for them. His trail of devastation had ended the lives of 35 people and caused horrific injuries to 23 victims. The number of people left affected by his crime would be too high to count. Days after the mass shooting, the country was trying to come to terms with their loss.
It shocked the nation, it shocked the world, but it really shocked Tasmania. And, you know, people were just numb, I think, for for days, weeks and months after it.
I got a message from John Major, the British Prime Minister. He recalled that the massacre in Dunblane in Scotland had claimed 27 lives, and John said he never imagined that within a few weeks the number killed there would be exceeded in Australia. It was a tragedy that, as the days went by, it unnerved the country. Nobody could believe that something of this magnitude had happened in Australia. These are the sort of things that happen in other countries. They don't happen in Australia. What Port Arthur did was to bring home the fact that there were gaps in the gun laws.
The Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, made quick, decisive actions to alter the legislation that was in place on guns.
The magnitude of the tragedy in Port Arthur provided the momentum for change to occur.
The law as it stood meant automatic and semi-automatic weapons were readily available and legal to citizens across Australia, with certain laws on licensing and ownership in place.
I looked at that character and I suppose I had to think, why was it so easy for you to harm so many people? Relatively insignificant character, simple-minded, but just had access to weapons that allowed him to do a heck of a lot of damage in a very short period of time.
The laws were reasonably strict, but obviously they weren't strict enough.
By the following month, the government had made the biggest change in their weapons policy to date, bringing in the National Firearms Agreement.
The agreement was that we'd have a nationwide ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and we'd have strict rules about how you looked after the guns that you're entitled to have. And then we said, well, to make it work, we've got to have a buyback. And that was part of it. And I said that the federal government would fund the buyback. Now, we bought back 750,000 guns.
I take my hat off to John Howard for doing what he did, for having the guts to stand up to the gun lobby, and as far as I'm concerned now, it ought to be a hell of a lot tougher to own a gun.
The timing was certainly right after Port Arthur, and it was the right thing to do. The way they approached it, and they gained a huge amount of support for it.
It has been successful. We've had since that legislation, if you define a mass murder or homicide as more than 5 killed in the same incident, we've not had any since then.
As people tried to rebuild their lives and readjust to the new gun laws, the fate of the man who wrecked so many lives was being sealed.
He wasn't mentally ill in the usual sense. He was fit to stand trial. He understood that he was charged and with 35 counts of murder and sundry other things. At that stage, when I met him, interviewed him at the prison, he was still denying his involvement.
We wanted to ensure that the police case, or the Crown's case, was so compelling and without flaw that we could successfully convict this individual for every murder that he committed.
He didn't change his mind until basically right at the end of the trial. He suddenly decided to plead guilty.
Martin Bryant's plea of guilty was accepted for all of the charges, and the Supreme Court of the day ordered 35 life sentences, and his papers were marked never to be released.
Martin Bryant was remanded in Risdon Prison, Tasmania, where he will spend the rest of his days. But despite the heartache caused, some people were intent on questioning whether he was the actual killer.
A lot of people came in afterwards, and a few of those people, for whatever motivation, came up with a different story.
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and Wright and Bryan didn't do it, and the government set him up, and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit, because it was nothing like that, and I was here, I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what happened. And I don't know where these stories originate and how they get going. It's just a load of rubbish, you know.
A poignant memorial now stands at the site where the Broad Arrow Cafe once was. A fitting tribute to all those affected by the tragedy on the 28th of April, 1996.
The Memorial Garden's designed for people to go there, reflect, think about things, spend their own bit of time.
The Bryant massacre just adds another layer to Port Arthur. It's horrible, it's awful, but it's not something to keep people away.
I can't help but think the best way to remember it is to recall the fact that out of this terrible tragedy, the country moved forward in gun control. And you can't remember the good without remembering the tragedy. These things are part of our history, and there's no point in trying to airbrush them.
Peter Crossell now is no longer the Peter Crossell 15 seconds before Bryant started shooting. He's a totally different person, and he is the better person. And I convinced myself that that was the case. So I moved forward in life with Port Arthur Massacre embellished in here and in here. End of story.
We can't just bury it, pretend it didn't happen, it didn't exist. And those people deserve more. The victims deserve more, the survivors deserve more, the families deserve more. It is part of Australian history, and I think we need to treat it as such.